Imagine this. You're walking through the streets of Boston in the 1870s when a group of children run past you, screaming. They say there's a boy hiding near the marshes, a boy who tricks kids into following him. And when they come back, if they come back at all, they're bleeding, broken. Some don't come back alive. The newspapers call him the Boy Fiend. The police whisper his name in disbelief. And his victims? They all say the same thing. He had dead eyes. But here's the part that makes this story unforgettable. The so-called monster terrorizing Boston wasn't a man at all. He was just 12 years old. Jesse Pomeroy looked like any other awkward boy on the street. Pale skin, crooked features, a thin frame. But behind that ordinary appearance was something that defied explanation, a hunger for cruelty that even hardened criminals couldn't comprehend. At first, no one believed it. How could a child tie up other children, strip them, cut them with knives, burn their skin with acid, and then simply walk home like nothing had happened? What could possibly twist a child's mind into something so unrecognizable, so dark, so monstrous? And yet Jesse wasn't finished. His violence didn't stop with torture. It escalated, until one day, a 4-year-old boy named Horace Millen was found dead in the sand, his small body mutilated in ways too gruesome for the papers to print. And standing at the center of it all was Jesse. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about the terrifying question nobody wants to answer. Can evil be born inside a child? Stay with me, because once you hear what Jesse Pomeroy did, and how society tried and failed to deal with him, you'll understand why his case is still whispered about more than a century later. Boston in the 1870s was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, it was proud, industrious, alive with the energy of a growing nation. Factories roared, ships came and went from the harbor, and immigrant families crammed into brick row houses, chasing the promise of a better life. But beneath the surface, the city was raw, overcrowded, and unforgiving. Cobblestone alleys reeked of sewage. Tenement blocks teemed with children who roamed the streets unsupervised, playing stickball near train yards, or wandering down to the marshes where no adult ever bothered to follow. In a city where survival was hard even for grown men, childhood innocence was fragile at best. Boston wasn't new to crime. There were gangs, pickpockets, drunken brawls in taverns. But crimes against children, especially by another child, were something no one was prepared to comprehend. The thought that a boy, barely into his teens, could lure younger children away and torture them. It felt impossible. Parents trusted that their children were safest when playing with other children. That trust was about to be shattered. When the first victims began stumbling home, bruised, beaten, and half-stripped of their clothes, people grasped for explanations. Maybe it was a cruel prank. Maybe older boys from the neighborhood had gone too far. But as the stories spread, a chill settled over Boston. The victims all described the same thing: a boy with a knife, a boy with strange, pale eyes, a boy who seemed to enjoy every second of their suffering. Newspapers of the era fed the panic, painting a picture of a city under siege by an unseen fiend. Headlines spoke of a child tormentor, though few believed the culprit could really be a child. Mothers began walking their sons to school. Fathers warned their children not to wander too far. And yet, the attacks kept happening. The backdrop was set, a bustling, vulnerable city, thousands of children free to roam, and somewhere among them, a predator hiding in plain sight. It was here, in this tense and uneasy Boston, that Jesse Pomeroy's reign of terror began. A reign that would transform him from an obscure, awkward boy into one of the youngest, most feared killers in American history. To understand Jesse Pomeroy, we have to step inside his childhood, a place as bleak and unsettling as the crimes he would later commit. Jesse was born in 1859 in Charlestown, Massachusetts, the son of Thomas and Ruth Pomeroy. His father, by all accounts, was a violent man, a war veteran who returned home with a short temper and a heavy hand. Thomas drank hard and disciplined harder. Neighbors whispered that Jesse bore the brunt of it. Beatings were common and sometimes savage. If cruelty breeds cruelty, Jesse's lessons began early. Physically, Jesse stood apart from the start. He was born with a pronounced facial deformity, a milky white eye caused by a corneal disease. It gave him a lopsided stare that unsettled those who met him. Some called it a dead eye. Children mocked him relentlessly, taunting him with cruel nicknames, pushing him out of games. He learned rejection young, and it festered. Teachers described Jesse as withdrawn, prone to sudden flashes of temper. Classmates said he could be quiet one moment, then explode into violence the next. Even at home, his relationship with his family was fractured. His father loomed as a threat, while his mother Ruth, though protective, seemed either unwilling or unable to stop Jesse's darker impulses. As Jesse grew older, something chilling began to show itself. He developed a fascination with violence. Some claimed they saw him torturing animals, practicing cruelty on the defenseless. Others noted how he lingered over stories of the Civil War, not out of patriotism, but to savor descriptions of battlefield suffering. For most boys, war tales were about bravery. For Jesse, they were about pain. By the time he was 10, Jesse's world had narrowed to two emotions: humiliation and rage. He was a boy mocked by his peers, brutalized by his father, and isolated from any sense of belonging. But instead of folding inward, Jesse turned outward. He discovered something that gave him power: fear. When he frightened other children, he wasn't the weak, deformed boy anymore. He was in control. Some psychologists looking back would argue Jesse was born a psychopath, incapable of empathy from the beginning. Others believe the relentless abuse and ridicule hardened him into something monstrous. Whatever the cause, the signs were there: the lack of remorse, the fascination with suffering, the hunger to dominate. What makes Jesse's story so disturbing is how young he was when this hunger became more than just a dark impulse. At 12 years old, while most boys were climbing trees and playing marbles, Jesse Pomeroy was already laying traps for victims. He had found his outlet, and once he started, he would not stop. The next chapter in Jesse's life would no longer be about whispers or suspicions. It would explode into the public eye with acts so vicious, Boston would label him the Fiend. It began quietly. A missing boy here, a shaken child there. At first, no one connected the dots, but by the fall of 1871, whispers about a strange boy preying on children began to ripple through Boston's neighborhoods. Jesse Pomeroy was just 12, but he had already learned how to stalk, how to isolate, how to lure. His victims were boys younger than himself, small, trusting, eager for friendship. Jesse promised games, or secret adventures, or simply asked them to follow him to the edge of town. And they did. Why wouldn't they? He was just another boy. But once Jesse had them alone, the mask slipped. His demeanor hardened, his voice sharpened, and from his pockets came the tools he had prepared: a knife, a rope, sometimes a whip. What followed was terror. Survivors later told stories that sound almost too horrific to come from a child. Jesse tied their wrists, stripped their clothes, and slashed at their skin. He cut their faces and backs with knives. He whipped them until they bled. Sometimes he pressed pins or needles into their flesh. Other times, he held their heads underwater until they nearly drowned, watching them struggle, then pulling them back at the last moment, only to do it again. The cruelty wasn't quick. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated. Jesse drew it out, savoring the fear, studying the pain as though he was learning from it. And when he was finished, he simply let the boys go, leaving them bloodied and half-dressed, stumbling home through the dirt. By December of 1871, at least 7 boys had been attacked. Their families were outraged, terrified, and desperate for answers. The children all described the same assailant: a boy, taller than them, with one strange, clouded eye that seemed to pierce right through them. The police at first struggled to believe it. The idea that a child could commit such acts felt impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. The victims' wounds were too specific, their stories too consistent. And the city was beginning to panic. Newspapers picked up the story, fueling the fire with lurid headlines about a boy torturer. Citizens whispered about a fiend in the flesh, a child who had turned into something monstrous. Parents clutched their children tighter, warning them not to stray, not to talk to strangers. But no warning seemed strong enough, because the predator was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a boy walking among them. Jesse's reign of terror should have ended quickly. He was arrested in late 1872 after multiple victims identified him. At just 13 years old, he stood before the court, his mother by his side, insisting her son was misunderstood. The judge sentenced him to the Massachusetts House of Reformation, essentially a juvenile detention facility. For the first time, it seemed the nightmare was over. Jesse was locked away. The city could breathe again. But what no one realized was that Jesse Pomeroy wasn't finished. Far from it. Because when Jesse walked out of confinement a year later, he didn't return a reformed boy. He came out colder, smarter, more dangerous, and soon, he would kill. April 22nd, 1874. It was a chilly afternoon in South Boston, the kind of day when children bundled in wool coats still ran barefoot through the sand by the shoreline. Among them was a boy named Horace Millen, only 4 years old. Horace was the youngest of his family, bright-eyed, innocent, and far too trusting. That morning, he told his mother he was going outside to play. He never came back. Neighbors later said they saw Horace walking hand in hand with an older boy, thin, pale, with one strange, clouded eye. The older boy looked like he might be guiding a younger brother, but that boy was Jesse Pomeroy, and he wasn't guiding Horace to safety. He was leading him into a nightmare. The two walked toward the marshes near Dorchester Bay, a stretch of land where the city met wild grass and sand. It was isolated, the perfect stage for Jesse's darkest impulses. What happened next was so horrific that even hardened police officers struggled to put it into words. Hours later, Horace's body was discovered by a passerby. He lay face down in the sand, his small frame brutally mutilated. His throat had been slashed from ear to ear. His chest and genitals bore stab wounds, dozens of them. His tiny body was marked by rage far beyond what anyone could comprehend from a child. The scene shocked even the most experienced investigators. There was no attempt to hide the crime. It was savage, chaotic, yet disturbingly intentional. And the details pointed to someone who had practiced cruelty before. Someone who knew how to control, how to hurt, how to savor suffering. Word spread quickly. Newspapers splashed the story across the front page. A 4-year-old boy slain. Mothers wept openly in the streets. Fathers demanded justice. Boston, already on edge from Jesse's earlier reign of terror, was now in full panic. The whispers of a boy fiend were no longer whispers. They were screams. And there was something else. Survivors of Jesse's earlier attacks, boys who had lived through his torture, read the papers and came forward. The descriptions matched. The dead eye, the pale, unsettling face. The predator who had once let them live had finally crossed the line. But here's what made the story all the more chilling. Jesse Pomeroy was just 14, barely a teenager. And yet, the savagery of Horace Millen's murder rivaled that of the most notorious adult killers. When investigators closed in, they weren't looking for a hardened man with a criminal record. They were looking for a boy in short trousers, a son who still lived with his mother. That contradiction, a child committing horrors that grown men recoiled from, was what kept Boston awake at night. Why Horace? Why that day? Nobody knows for certain. Perhaps Jesse saw him as an easy target. Perhaps it was pure impulse. Or perhaps, chillingly, Jesse had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to push his violence to the ultimate limit. What's undeniable is that Horace Millen's death marked the point of no return. Jesse had escalated from torture to murder, and there was no turning back. The city demanded answers. Police swarmed South Boston. Witnesses came forward, and soon the net began to close around Jesse. His days of walking free with his dead-eyed stare were numbered. The hunt for the boy fiend had begun. The murder of Horace Millen ripped through Boston like a thunderclap. This was no longer whispers about a child torturer. This was a corpse, a crime scene too brutal for polite society to even describe aloud. The city's police, often slow and disorganized in the 1870s, now moved with urgency. They knew they were hunting a predator, and panic demanded results. Investigators canvassed the marshes where Horace was found. They questioned locals, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen a boy leading another by the hand that day. Again and again the description came back the same. a teenager with one eye clouded and strange, that dead gray stare. For detectives, the name came quickly: Jesse Pomeroy. He had already been arrested once for torturing younger boys and had only recently been released from the House of Reformation. The pattern was undeniable. The brutality, the victims, the eye, it all pointed to him. When officers arrived at Jesse's home, they found him with his mother. He was calm, too calm. Neighbors described him sitting stiffly, answering questions without flinching, as though nothing in the world could touch him. But then came the evidence. Horace Millen's body bore distinct cuts, slashes that seemed almost like a signature. Police compared them to injuries described by Jesse's earlier victims. They matched. One boy who had survived Jesse's torture was brought forward, and the moment he saw Jesse's face, he recoiled. That's him. That's the boy. Inside Jesse's belongings, investigators found a knife. The blade was stained. It didn't take long to put the pieces together. The police had their suspect, and their suspect was just 14. News of Jesse's arrest swept through Boston, sparking both relief and horror. Parents clutched their children tighter, grateful the boy fiend had been caught. But for many, the real shock was seeing him in person. In court appearances and police reports, Jesse looked so young, so slight, almost delicate. He didn't look like a monster. And yet, the crimes told a different story. A story of sadism, torture, and now murder. Reporters scrambled to capture the contradiction. Headlines screamed about a child killer and a youthful fiend. Ordinary citizens lined up outside the courthouse, straining to catch a glimpse of the boy who had stolen their city's sense of safety. Some shouted for his execution, others whispered that he must be insane. But one thing was clear: Jesse could no longer hide behind the illusion of childhood. He had become the most hated, most feared boy in America. And the question looming over Boston now was not whether he had done it, but what should be done with him. The trial of Jesse Pomeroy would force an entire society to ask, can a child truly be held responsible for evil this dark? The trial of Jesse Pomeroy in 1874 was unlike anything Boston, or America, had ever seen. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, their breath hanging in the cold spring air, desperate to glimpse the boy everyone called the Boston Boy Fiend. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Men in stiff suits, women in heavy dresses, and newspaper reporters scratching notes furiously. At the center of it all sat Jesse, just 14 years old. His pale face, his narrow frame, and that unsettling white eye seemed to contradict every instinct people had about what a murderer should look like. He looked more like the victim than the villain. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The prosecution laid it out in gruesome detail. They described the mutilated body of little Horace Millen, the slash across his throat, the countless stab wounds. They reminded the jury of Jesse's past crimes, the torture of at least 7 other boys. Survivors themselves were called to the stand. Children trembling as they pointed at Jesse and told the court what he had done to them. The ropes, the knives, the needles. The gasps from the gallery were audible. Mothers wept openly. Fathers clenched their fists. And through it all, Jesse sat expressionless. Some said he looked bored. Others said his lips curled into a faint smirk when his victims described their pain. The coldness of his demeanor only deepened the public's horror. The defense, desperate to save him, leaned on his age. How could a boy, barely into adolescence, be judged by the same standards as grown men? His mother, Ruth, insisted he was misunderstood, that he had been bullied and abused, that he was sick and needed help, not punishment. Some doctors suggested he might be insane, but even insanity seemed too mild a word for what Jesse had done. The jury didn't take long. They found him guilty of murder in the first degree. The penalty for such a crime was death by hanging. And when the judge read the sentence, a wave of approval swept through the gallery. At last, the boy fiend would pay for his crimes. But then came the complication. Jesse was only 14. Hanging a child, even one capable of such horror, raised fierce debate. Politicians, clergy, and ordinary citizens argued furiously. Some demanded his execution, insisting that his age meant nothing compared to his cruelty. Others recoiled at the thought of seeing a child swing from the gallows. In the end, Massachusetts Governor William Gaston made the decision that would define Jesse's fate. He commuted Jesse's sentence from death to life in prison. Jesse would not die on the gallows. Instead, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The decision outraged many. Crowds rioted outside the courthouse, furious that the boy fiend had been spared. But others saw it as a grim compromise. Jesse's punishment would not be death, but a slow, suffocating existence inside a cell. Still, the trial left behind a question that haunted everyone who had seen Jesse in person. How could a boy, barely out of childhood, commit acts so grotesque they defied human understanding? Boston had demanded justice, and justice had been served. But the unease lingered. Because if Jesse Pomeroy could become a monster, what did that mean for every other child running free in the streets? Jesse Pomeroy was just 14 when the gavel fell, and the court declared he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. No gallows, no rope. Instead, a punishment some argued was worse. Endless years of confinement, watching the world grow older while he remained locked away. He entered the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown in 1875, the youngest inmate ever to pass through its iron gates. Most of the men inside were hardened criminals, murderers, thieves, violent drunks, and yet none of them inspired as much unease as Jesse. A boy among men, yes, but a boy whose blank stare and reputation carried a weight even the toughest convicts respected or feared. Officials placed Jesse in solitary confinement. His sentence was harsh. A small cell, scarcely wide enough to stretch out, lit by only a narrow slit of daylight. 23 hours a day alone, 1 hour outside to walk the yard. That was his world. And for decades, it barely changed. Some said it broke him. Others said it preserved him. In the silence of his cell, Jesse began to write. Letters, petitions, endless appeals for his release. In them he painted himself as misunderstood, a victim of circumstance, insisting he had been judged too harshly as a child. But the words on the page did little to convince those who remembered Horace Millen, or the 7 boys who had survived his sadism. Prison guards who watched Jesse over the years described him as detached, strange, still chilling even in his isolation. One noted that his eyes never softened, not even in middle age. Another swore Jesse would sit for hours without moving, staring through the bars as though he could see something beyond them, something no one else could. Year after year, governor after governor received petitions for his parole. Year after year, they were denied. Jesse would never again walk the streets of Boston, and yet, in a way, his presence never left the city. The boy fiend became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children as a reminder of what lurked behind the mask of innocence. Jesse's cell became less a prison and more a tomb, a place where the youngest convicted murderer in Massachusetts slowly withered away, serving not just a sentence but a lifetime reminder of what he had done. By the time Jesse Pomeroy died in 1932, at the age of 72, he had spent nearly 60 years behind bars. He entered prison a boy. He died an old man. But in the public imagination, he remained forever what he was in 1874. The child with the dead eyes who became a monster. Even after Jesse Pomeroy vanished behind prison walls, his shadow never left Boston. For decades, his name lingered like a curse, whispered in hushed tones, printed in sensational headlines, invoked whenever parents needed to frighten restless children into obedience. Behave, or the boy fiend will get you. Jesse's case shook the foundations of law and morality in Massachusetts. Never before had the courts confronted such a question. What do you do when the criminal is a child, but the crimes are those of a monster? His trial forced judges, lawmakers, and the public to grapple with issues of juvenile justice that still resonate today. Should children be punished like adults, or should society treat them as victims of circumstance, capable of redemption? For many, Jesse's existence seemed to prove that evil could appear at any age. His blank stare, his calculated cruelty, his utter lack of remorse, these were not the tantrums of a troubled boy. They were the traits of something far darker. Historians and psychologists continue to debate him. Was Jesse a product of his environment, abused, bullied, pushed into violence until he broke? Or was he born different, carrying inside him an emptiness that no love, no kindness could ever have filled? The question has no simple answer, and that uncertainty is part of why his story endures. By the time Jesse died in 1932, the world had changed. The streets of Boston were filled with cars instead of horse-drawn wagons. The children he once terrorized had grown old and passed away, but his legend outlived them all. The Boston Boy Fiend became part of American true crime folklore, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear the most ordinary faces. And sometimes those faces are the faces of children. Jesse Pomeroy entered history as the youngest convicted murderer in Massachusetts. 14 years old, sentenced not to death, but to a lifetime of silence inside a prison cell. But his story doesn't really end there, because long after Jesse took his final breath in 1932, the questions he left behind are still alive. Questions that are darker than the crimes themselves. What makes a child into a killer? Was Jesse a product of his father's beatings, of a childhood warped by cruelty and ridicule? Was he molded into a monster by the pain he endured? Or was he born this way, with something missing, some essential piece of humanity absent from the start? Psychologists today would use words like psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. They would talk about a lack of empathy, an inability to feel remorse, a hunger for control. But even those clinical terms can't soften the reality. Jesse Pomeroy enjoyed watching others suffer, and he was just a boy. That truth unsettles us because it breaks the rules we want to believe about innocence. Children are supposed to be blank slates, capable of being shaped, nurtured, saved. But Jesse forces us to ask, what if some darkness is born into the world fully formed? What if, sometimes, monsters don't grow up? They're children already. The people of Boston never found peace with that question. Some clung to the belief that Jesse was an anomaly, a freak occurrence, never to be repeated. Others saw him as proof of something more terrifying, that evil has no age limit, and that's why his case endures, not because of the number of his victims, not because of the decades he spent behind bars, but because Jesse Pomeroy makes us confront a truth we'd rather turn away from. That sometimes innocence is a mask, and sometimes when you look into the eyes of a child, you might see nothing looking back. So, what do you think? Was Jesse Pomeroy born evil, or was he created by the world around him? Was he a victim of abuse who turned his pain outward, or was he something else entirely, something we still can't name? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story chilling, disturbing, and unforgettable, make sure to subscribe for more dark histories and true crime tales. Because this was just one story, and there are countless more waiting in the shadows.